The moment she said those 7 words, everyone on the plane stopped pretending not to listen. It was 6:40 on a rainy Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, and Gate B-27 was packed with travelers heading to New York City. Business executives checked emails, families wrangled sleepy children, and frequent flyers lined up for priority boarding. Among them stood Victoria Sinclair, a 48-year-old luxury real estate executive known in corporate circles for getting exactly what she wanted. Dressed in a cream designer suit, carrying a limited edition handbag worth more than most Americans earned in a month, Victoria moved through the terminal with the confidence of someone accustomed to special treatment. The gate agents greeted her by name, and she acknowledged them with a quick nod before stepping into the jet bridge for first-class boarding. Victoria settled into seat 2A, placed her tablet neatly on the tray table, and ordered sparkling water before most passengers had even found their rows. She glanced around the cabin with quiet satisfaction. First class was her space, her routine, her comfort zone. Then she noticed someone stopping beside seat 2B. The man was tall, probably in his early 50s, with silver beginning to show at his temples. He wore dark slacks, polished shoes, and a simple navy blazer. Nothing flashy. No expensive watch on display. No designer luggage covered in luxury logos. He carried only a worn leather briefcase and a hardcover book tucked beneath his arm. The boarding pass in his hand clearly read 2B. Victoria's expression changed instantly. The man smiled politely. "Good morning," he said warmly as he prepared to place his briefcase in the overhead compartment. Victoria did not return the greeting. Instead, she stared at him for several uncomfortable seconds before pressing the call button above her seat. A nearby flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "Is there something I can help you with, Miss Sinclair?" Victoria pointed openly toward the man standing beside her. "Yes," she said loudly enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "You need to move him." The flight attendant blinked. "I'm sorry." Victoria crossed her arms. "I don't sit next to people like him." The words hung in the air. Conversations stopped. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A young woman near row 3 slowly lowered her phone. Even the flight attendant seemed momentarily frozen. The gentleman in seat 2B remained completely still. He neither argued nor reacted. Instead, he simply looked at Victoria with calm, steady eyes. No anger, no embarrassment, just quiet composure. And somehow, that silence made everyone in first class even more uncomfortable. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Melissa, forced a professional smile even as tension spread through the first-class cabin. "Miss Sinclair, seat assignments are confirmed, and Mr. Reed is assigned to seat 2B, she said carefully. Victoria leaned back in her seat as if the answer itself offended her. "Then assign him somewhere else," she replied. "I paid for first class, and I expect a certain level of comfort." Melissa glanced toward Marcus Reed, expecting frustration or perhaps an argument, but he simply stood beside his seat, one hand resting lightly on his leather briefcase. "Ma'am," Melissa said softly, "the flight is nearly full. There are no other first-class seats available." Victoria shook her head. "That is not my problem. I fly more than 100,000 miles a year with this airline. Surely you can make something happen." Several nearby passengers exchanged uneasy looks. A middle-aged couple seated across the aisle quietly stopped their conversation. 2 rows back, a college student wearing headphones discreetly lifted his phone, apparently sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Melissa lowered her voice. "Ms. Sinclair, I understand your concern, but Mr. Reed has every right to sit in his assigned seat." Victoria did not lower hers. "I am not trying to be difficult," she announced loudly, making certain everyone could hear. "I simply prefer not to sit next to him." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was calm and measured. "Ma'am, you are certainly entitled to your preferences." He offered a small, polite smile. "If the airline wishes to move me, I will cooperate." Melissa looked relieved by his gracious response, but Victoria appeared almost irritated by his composure. She had clearly expected resistance. "Good," she said. That settles it. Melissa hesitated. Sir, I appreciate your understanding, but you purchased this seat, and we are not asking you to move. Marcus nodded once. Then I will remain where I was assigned. Victoria let out an exasperated sigh. Unbelievable. By now, nearly everyone in first class was watching openly. A businessman seated in row 3 quietly whispered to his wife, who shook her head in disbelief. The young student with the phone continued recording discreetly from several rows away. Marcus calmly placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and settled into seat 2B. He opened his hardcover book as though nothing unusual had happened. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. You are actually staying? She asked. Marcus looked up from his book. Yes, ma'am, he answered pleasantly. This is my seat. Victoria pressed the call button again with obvious frustration. As Melissa returned, the captain's voice suddenly came over the intercom announcing that boarding would soon be complete. Yet inside first class, nobody seemed interested in departure anymore. Every eye remained fixed on seats 2A and 2B, because everyone sensed that this story was far from over. Melissa stood beside row 2, maintaining the composed expression that years of airline service had taught her, but even she could feel the atmosphere inside the cabin changing. Boarding had nearly finished, yet nobody seemed interested in stowing luggage anymore. Every glance drifted back toward seats 2A and 2B. Victoria pressed the call button for the third time in less than 2 minutes. The soft chime sounded through first class. Yes, Ms. Sinclair? Melissa asked as she returned. Victoria straightened in her seat. I would like to speak to a supervisor immediately. Melissa nodded politely. I am the lead flight attendant on today's flight. How may I assist you? Victoria looked genuinely offended. Then perhaps you can explain why this situation has not been resolved. She gestured toward Marcus without even looking at him. I have made it perfectly clear that I am uncomfortable. Marcus quietly turned a page in his book. Ma'am, Melissa said carefully, Mr. Reed has done nothing inappropriate. He is seated in the seat assigned to him. Victoria let out a short laugh. That is not the point. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Across the aisle, an older woman quietly whispered, This is unbelievable. Her husband nodded silently. Victoria continued speaking, seemingly unaware of how many people were listening. I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every year flying first class. Loyalty should mean something. Melissa maintained her professionalism. We greatly value your business, Ms. Sinclair. However, all passengers deserve equal treatment. For the first time, Marcus closed his book. He turned slightly toward Victoria. If my presence is causing distress, I would be happy to request another seat in coach. His voice remained calm and respectful. Melissa immediately shook her head. Sir, that will not be necessary. Victoria folded her arms. Well, at least someone here understands customer service. Marcus simply smiled. Actually, ma'am, I understand that everyone here has somewhere important to be this morning. Delaying the flight over a seating assignment does not seem fair to the other passengers. The simplicity of his response made several people nearby nod in agreement. Victoria noticed. Her expression hardened. She clearly was not accustomed to losing the sympathy of a room. You are making this unnecessarily difficult, she said sharply. Marcus met her gaze with remarkable composure. I assure you, ma'am, that is not my intention. Before Victoria could respond, a voice came from 3 rows back. Lady, just let the man sit down, a passenger said. Another traveler quietly added, We would all like to leave on time. Victoria looked stunned that strangers had spoken up. She glanced around and suddenly realized that nearly everyone in first class was watching her. Yet instead of stepping back, she seemed to double down. I am simply expressing my concerns, she insisted. People should be allowed to choose who they sit next to. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You are free to make your own choices, ma'am. He paused briefly before adding, So is everyone else. The comment was delivered without anger, but it carried enough quiet dignity that the cabin fell silent again. At that exact moment, an unexpected voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before departure, there is one passenger I would personally like to welcome aboard." Several passengers looked around curiously. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes from his book. The cabin grew noticeably quieter as passengers waited to hear what the captain was about to say. Even Victoria stopped speaking. The captain continued over the intercom. "Before we depart for New York this morning, I would like to extend a very special welcome aboard. We are honored to have one of our valued guests traveling with us today. On behalf of the entire flight crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us again." A few passengers smiled politely, assuming the message was intended for a celebrity or frequent flyer somewhere on the aircraft. Victoria immediately straightened in her seat, clearly convinced the greeting was meant for her. She had accumulated millions of airline miles over the years and had never been shy about reminding people of it. She gave a satisfied smile and adjusted her jacket. "Well, at least somebody on this airline still recognizes loyalty," she said loudly enough for several nearby passengers to hear. Melissa said nothing. Instead, she glanced briefly toward Marcus. The subtle look did not go unnoticed by a businessman seated across the aisle. He raised an eyebrow but remained silent. The captain resumed speaking. "We especially appreciate passengers who have traveled with us for many years, while making extraordinary contributions to communities across America." Victoria nodded confidently, apparently hearing exactly what she wanted to hear. Marcus, meanwhile, simply reopened his book. He appeared completely uninterested in the announcement. The captain concluded his remarks without mentioning a name, and moments later the aircraft door closed. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Melissa and another flight attendant began preparing the cabin for departure. When Melissa reached row 2, she leaned slightly toward Marcus. "Sir, it is wonderful to see you again," she said warmly. "I hope your trip to New York goes smoothly." Marcus smiled. "Thank you, Melissa. It is always good to see familiar faces." Victoria immediately looked from Melissa to Marcus. "You know each other?" she asked. Melissa maintained her professional demeanor. "Mr. Reed has flown with us many times." Victoria gave a dismissive laugh. "Well, I suppose anyone can collect miles." Marcus offered no response. Instead, he simply thanked Melissa for her kindness and returned to reading. Victoria shook her head. "Interesting," she muttered. "You certainly have everyone fooled." The older woman across the aisle finally could not remain silent. "Excuse me," she said politely but firmly. "The gentleman has done nothing except sit quietly. Perhaps we should all simply enjoy the flight." Victoria turned toward her. "I am entitled to my opinion." "Of course you are," the woman replied. "But kindness costs nothing." Victoria looked away without answering. A few minutes later, as the aircraft climbed above the clouds, beverage service began. Melissa arrived at row 2 carrying a tray. Before Victoria could speak, Melissa addressed Marcus first. "Dr. Reed, would you care for your usual tea?" Several passengers looked up immediately. Marcus smiled warmly. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Victoria froze. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. She had heard the title clearly. Dr. Reed. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty crossed her face. Yet instead of reconsidering her behavior, she leaned back and whispered under her breath, "Doctor or not, people should know where they belong." Unfortunately for Victoria, she was not as quiet as she thought, and more than one passenger heard every word. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably after hearing Victoria's comment. The older woman across the aisle slowly removed her glasses and stared out the window, clearly choosing silence over confrontation. Melissa, however, had heard every word. So had the businessman in row 3. So had the college student, whose phone was still resting discreetly on his lap. Marcus simply lifted his teacup and thanked Melissa once again. "This is perfect," he said warmly. "You always remember." Melissa smiled. "Some passengers are easy to remember, Dr. Reed." Victoria could not hide her irritation. "You seem to know everyone on this airline," she remarked. Marcus nodded politely. I travel often. Doing what exactly? Victoria asked. The question sounded less like conversation and more like an interrogation. Marcus paused for a moment before answering. I work in healthcare. Victoria gave a skeptical smile. Healthcare is a very broad field. Yes, it is, Marcus replied calmly before returning to his book. The answer clearly frustrated Victoria. She had expected details, titles, credentials, something she could measure. Instead, Marcus offered nothing more. For nearly 30 minutes, the flight remained peaceful. The aircraft cruised smoothly above the clouds while most passengers settled into their routines. Some slept. Others worked on laptops. Marcus quietly read while occasionally making notes in the margins of his book. Then Melissa returned carrying a small envelope. Dr. Reed, she said softly. Captain Harris asked me to deliver this personally. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. That was not necessary. He insisted, Melissa said with a smile. Marcus opened the envelope and found a handwritten note. He read it briefly, smiled, and carefully placed it inside his briefcase. Victoria had been watching the entire exchange. Another special favor? She asked. Marcus looked toward her. Just a kind message from an old acquaintance. You and the captain are acquainted? Victoria asked. We have crossed paths a few times over the years, Marcus answered. Before Victoria could continue, a young boy from row 5 approached nervously, accompanied by his mother. The boy appeared to be around 10 years old. Excuse me, sir, the mother said apologetically. My son thinks he recognizes you, and I told him he should not interrupt people, but he insisted on asking. Marcus immediately closed his book. That is perfectly all right. The boy looked excited. Are you Dr. Marcus Reed from Hope Forward? The entire section of first class seemed to stop breathing. Marcus smiled modestly. Yes, I am. The boy's eyes widened. You helped build the Children's Hospital in Chicago. My sister was treated there. The mother's eyes suddenly filled with emotion. Your foundation covered part of her treatment 3 years ago. We never had the chance to thank you. Marcus stood and shook her hand warmly. I am very happy to hear your daughter is doing well. Several nearby passengers exchanged surprised looks. Even Melissa appeared touched, although she clearly was not surprised. Victoria sat completely still. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty had given way to something else. Confusion. Because the quiet man she had dismissed less than an hour earlier was beginning to look very different from the stranger she thought she had judged so accurately. The young boy reluctantly returned to his seat, still grinning from ear to ear, while his mother thanked Marcus one final time. As they walked away, whispers immediately spread through the first-class cabin. The businessman across the aisle quietly searched something on his tablet. A few seconds later, his eyebrows shot upward. He looked at Marcus, then back at the screen, clearly surprised by what he had found. Victoria noticed the reaction. Who exactly are you? She asked, no longer able to hide her curiosity. Marcus smiled politely. Just someone fortunate enough to help where I can. Victoria frowned. People do not build hospitals by simply helping where they can. Marcus offered no further explanation. Instead, he reopened his book and resumed reading. The conversation appeared finished, at least from his perspective. Victoria, however, was becoming increasingly unsettled. For nearly an hour she had confidently assumed she understood the man sitting beside her. Now that certainty was beginning to unravel. A few minutes later, Melissa returned once again, this time accompanied by another flight attendant carrying a small tray. Dr. Reed, Melissa said warmly. Captain Harris asked us to bring this from the galley. He remembered that you prefer fresh fruit during morning flights. Marcus looked genuinely embarrassed by the attention. Please thank the captain, but this is far too generous. Melissa smiled. He insisted. Several passengers openly stared. First-class travelers were accustomed to premium service, but personalized requests from the captain were something entirely different. Victoria watched silently as Marcus thanked both flight attendants by name. How many times have you flown this route? She finally asked. Marcus thought for a moment. Over the years? Probably several hundred. For work, Victoria pressed. Mostly, Marcus replied. Healthcare keeps me busy. Before Victoria could continue questioning him, the businessman across the aisle leaned forward. Excuse me, Dr. Reed, he said respectfully. I apologize for interrupting, but are you the same Marcus Reed who established the Hope Forward Foundation? Marcus nodded modestly. I am involved with the organization, yes. The businessman extended his hand immediately. My company partnered with your scholarship program in Detroit. It changed a lot of lives. Marcus shook his hand warmly. That was a team effort. The businessman smiled. You are being humble. Your foundation has awarded more than 10,000 scholarships. Victoria stared in disbelief. She had never heard Marcus mention any of this. In fact, he had gone out of his way to avoid discussing himself. That realization bothered her almost as much as the information itself. She was accustomed to successful people announcing their achievements within minutes of meeting someone. Marcus had done the opposite. As the conversation ended, Captain Harris suddenly emerged from the cockpit. This alone was unusual during a commercial flight. The captain walked directly to row 2. Dr. Reed, he said with a broad smile, extending his hand. It is an honor to have you aboard again. Marcus stood and shook his hand warmly. Thank you, Captain. It is always good flying with you. Captain Harris smiled. My daughter still talks about the mentorship program you created for medical students. You changed her life. For the second time that morning, the entire cabin fell completely silent, and Victoria could no longer ignore the growing realization that she had judged the wrong man. Captain Harris remained beside Marcus for another moment, speaking with the easy familiarity of two people who had known each other for years. My daughter starts her residency next month, the captain said proudly. She still keeps the letter you wrote her when she was accepted into medical school. Marcus smiled warmly. She earned that opportunity herself. I only offered encouragement. Captain Harris shook his head. You always say that. After wishing Marcus a pleasant flight, the captain returned to the cockpit. As soon as he disappeared behind the door, the atmosphere in first class changed once again. Passengers who had remained silent earlier were now openly curious. Several offered Marcus polite greetings. Others simply nodded respectfully. Victoria sat motionless, staring straight ahead. For the first time that morning, she appeared uncertain. Yet pride is a difficult thing to surrender, especially for someone who had spent years believing that status determined a person's worth. After several minutes of silence, Victoria finally spoke. So, you run some kind of charity? Her tone suggested that she was searching for a way to minimize everything she had just witnessed. Marcus closed his book and looked toward her. Hope Forward operates hospitals, scholarship programs, and community health initiatives in several cities. Victoria gave a small shrug. That explains why people recognize you. Marcus simply nodded. Perhaps. Victoria studied him carefully. You never mentioned any of this earlier. Marcus smiled gently. You never asked with genuine interest. The response was delivered so calmly that it caught Victoria off guard. Across the aisle, the older couple exchanged knowing glances. Victoria looked away for a moment before speaking again. Well, appearances can be misleading. Several nearby passengers subtly reacted to the irony of her statement. Marcus, however, showed no sign of satisfaction or resentment. They often are, he agreed. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the tension between them might finally disappear. Then Victoria glanced at Marcus's worn leather briefcase resting beneath the seat. Still, she said, most successful people I know present themselves differently. The cabin became quiet once more. Marcus regarded her with the same composed expression he had maintained all morning. How someone presents themselves is a personal choice, he said. Character matters far more. Victoria gave a short laugh. That sounds nice in theory, but the real world does not work that way. Marcus looked out the window at the clouds passing below. In my experience, the real world eventually reveals exactly who people are. The words lingered in the air. The businessman across the aisle slowly returned to his tablet. while the older woman resumed reading her magazine. No one spoke. Nearly another hour passed before the captain announced that they had begun their descent into New York. As passengers prepared for landing, many were still thinking about the remarkable man in seat 2B. Victoria, however, appeared preoccupied by something else entirely. She repeatedly checked her phone, though there was no signal yet. When the aircraft finally touched down and taxied toward the gate, she seemed eager to leave. She had no idea that within the next 24 hours, the brief encounter she desperately wanted to forget would become impossible to escape. As soon as the aircraft reached the gate at LaGuardia Airport, passengers began gathering their belongings, but unlike the tense silence that had filled the cabin before takeoff, the atmosphere now felt entirely different. Several travelers paused beside seat 2B to shake Marcus's hand before leaving. The businessman across the aisle thanked him again for his scholarship work. The mother whose daughter had been treated at the children's hospital asked if she could take a photograph with him for her family. Marcus agreed graciously, speaking with each person as though they were old friends rather than strangers he had met only hours earlier. Victoria remained seated, clearly impatient. She avoided eye contact with everyone around her and repeatedly checked her phone as soon as service returned. The moment the aircraft door opened, her device exploded with notifications. Emails, text messages, missed calls. More messages continued arriving every few seconds. Victoria frowned. She normally received dozens of messages every morning, but this was different. There were far too many. Without looking at Marcus, she stood quickly, retrieved her designer luggage, and moved toward the aisle. As she passed Marcus, she hesitated briefly. For a moment, it seemed as though she might say something. Instead, she simply walked away. Marcus watched her leave without expression before returning his attention to thanking Melissa and the crew. "Safe travels, Dr. Reed," Melissa said warmly. "Thank you for everything you do." Marcus smiled. "And thank you for treating every passenger with dignity. It matters more than you know." Meanwhile, Victoria hurried through the terminal, her heels clicking rapidly across the polished floor. As she approached baggage claim, her phone rang again. The caller identification displayed the name of her executive assistant, Rachel. Victoria answered immediately. "Rachel, what is going on? Why do I have 43 messages?" There was a brief silence on the other end. "Victoria, we have a serious problem." Victoria stopped walking. "What kind of problem?" Rachel lowered her voice. "There is a video online." Victoria frowned. "What video?" "From the flight this morning." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" Rachel hesitated. "Someone recorded the incident on the plane. It was uploaded less than 2 hours ago. It is everywhere." Victoria suddenly noticed several people nearby glancing at their phones and then looking in her direction. One young man whispered something to his friend while staring openly. Victoria turned away immediately. "How many people have seen it?" she demanded. Rachel exhaled nervously. "The last time I checked, more than 2 million views." Victoria froze. "That is impossible." "It has been shared by major accounts all morning," Rachel said quietly. "People are identifying you by name." Victoria's face drained of color. "Take it down," she said sharply. "Call legal. Call public relations. Do something." Rachel remained silent for several seconds before responding. "Victoria, there is something else. The board has called an emergency meeting for 9 o'clock. They said your attendance is mandatory." Victoria tightened her grip on the phone. "Why would the board be involved?" Rachel answered softly. "Because Dr. Marcus Reed is scheduled to attend the meeting too." Victoria stood motionless near baggage claim as travelers streamed around her. For several seconds, she could not process what Rachel had just said. "Why would Marcus Reed attend a board meeting at Sinclair Urban Development?" she finally asked. Rachel hesitated. "I assumed you already knew." Victoria tightened her grip on the phone. "Knew what?" "Dr. Reed represents Hope Forward Capital." Victoria felt a sudden wave of confusion. Hope Forward is a charity. It is also connected to one of the largest social impact investment funds in the country, Rachel explained. They have been leading negotiations with us for months. Victoria's heart began to race. 3 months earlier, Sinclair Urban Development had quietly entered discussions with a major investment group. The company had been struggling with declining revenue, stalled projects, and mounting debt. Securing this partnership had become Victoria's most important objective. Without it, several major developments could collapse. "No," Victoria whispered. "That cannot be right." "I am looking at the meeting agenda right now," Rachel said softly. "Dr. Marcus Reed is listed as Chair of Strategic Investments." Victoria immediately ended the call and opened her email. There it was. Emergency board meeting. Attendance required. 9 o'clock sharp. Attached beneath the agenda was a photograph of the visiting delegation. Victoria stared at the image in disbelief. Standing at the center of the photograph, smiling calmly beside several executives, was Marcus Reed, the same man she had publicly humiliated only hours earlier. A cold feeling settled over her. She quickly searched for the video Rachel had mentioned. It took less than 5 seconds to find it. The recording began with her pointing toward Marcus and demanding that he be moved. The audio was painfully clear. Every word, every expression, every dismissive gesture. The comments below were devastating. Thousands of viewers criticized her behavior. Others praised Marcus for remaining calm and dignified. Several national media accounts had already reposted the clip. Even worse, someone had identified her as Chief Executive Officer of Sinclair Urban Development. Victoria immediately called the company's head of public relations. "David, I need this removed immediately." David sounded exhausted. "We are trying, Victoria, but the video has already spread everywhere. News outlets are contacting us for statements." "Then issue one," Victoria demanded. "We are preparing something," David replied carefully. "But the board instructed us not to release anything until after the meeting." That answer alarmed her even more. The board rarely overruled executive communications. Victoria hurried into a waiting car and instructed the driver to take her directly to corporate headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. During the drive, her phone continued vibrating nonstop. Clients were canceling meetings. Business partners were requesting explanations. One longtime investor had simply sent a single message. "Is this really you?" By the time Victoria arrived at headquarters, several employees standing near the entrance abruptly stopped talking as she approached. Some looked away. Others offered uncomfortable smiles. Victoria entered the elevator alone. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. For the first time in years, she did not recognize the confident executive staring back. 24 hours earlier, she had believed she controlled everything. Now she was riding toward a meeting where the quiet man she had dismissed on a plane might determine the future of her entire company. Victoria stepped out of the elevator onto the 32nd floor and immediately sensed that something was wrong. The executive suite, usually buzzing with confident conversations and hurried meetings, had fallen unnaturally quiet. Employees who normally greeted her enthusiastically now offered only brief nods before quickly returning to their desks. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Victoria walked briskly toward the boardroom, determined to regain control of the situation before the meeting began. Rachel was waiting outside the conference room, clutching a tablet against her chest. "Good morning," Victoria said, attempting to sound composed. Rachel hesitated. The board arrived early. "They have already been meeting for 20 minutes. Victoria frowned. "Without me?" Rachel nodded nervously. Dr. Reed arrived shortly after 8. Victoria felt her stomach tighten again. "Is he inside now?" "Yes," Rachel said softly. "Along with the entire investment team." Victoria took a deep breath and adjusted her jacket. She had spent 20 years building Sinclair Urban Development. She refused to allow one embarrassing incident to destroy everything. As she reached for the conference room door, Rachel gently touched her arm. "Victoria, there is something else you should know." Victoria looked impatient. "What now?" Rachel lowered her voice. The board watched the video before the meeting started. Victoria closed her eyes briefly before pushing open the door. The conversation inside stopped instantly. 12 board members sat around the polished oak table. At the far end sat Marcus Reed. He was dressed exactly as he had been on the plane, wearing the same navy blazer and carrying the same worn leather briefcase. Yet in this room, surrounded by executives and financial analysts, he somehow commanded even greater presence. Marcus looked up as Victoria entered. His expression remained calm and professional. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no hostility. "Good morning, Ms. Sinclair," he said politely. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Victoria slowly took her seat. Board Chairman Harold Bennett cleared his throat. "Thank you all for attending on such short notice." He glanced toward Marcus. "Dr. Reed and Hope Forward Capital have spent months evaluating our company." Harold paused. "As everyone knows, Sinclair Urban Development requires substantial investment to complete 3 major projects currently at risk." Victoria nodded. Those projects represented nearly $600 million in potential revenue. Without outside funding, the company faced severe financial consequences. Harold continued. Hope Forward Capital was prepared to provide that funding. Victoria looked toward Marcus. For the first time, she fully understood what Rachel had tried to tell her. Marcus was not simply representing the investors. He was the investors. Hope Forward Capital controlled billions in assets dedicated to socially responsible development projects across the country. Marcus opened his briefcase and removed several documents. "Our team completed its final review last week," he said calmly. "Financially, Sinclair Urban Development possesses strong long-term potential." Several board members visibly relaxed. Then Marcus continued. "However, Hope Forward Capital evaluates more than financial performance." He looked directly at Victoria. "We also examine leadership values, organizational culture, and ethical standards." The room fell silent. Nobody needed clarification regarding what he meant. The video playing across millions of screens had already answered that question. Victoria felt every eye in the boardroom turn toward her. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence was far more uncomfortable than any accusation could have been. Chairman Harold Bennett finally folded his hands on the table. "Dr. Reed, before we continue discussing the investment proposal, several members of the board believe we need to address this morning's events." Marcus nodded calmly. "I understand." Harold turned toward Victoria. "Victoria, would you like to explain the circumstances surrounding the video?" Victoria straightened in her chair. Years in executive leadership had taught her how to recover from difficult situations. "The video does not reflect the entire context," she began carefully. "It was an unfortunate misunderstanding during a stressful travel day." Several board members exchanged skeptical glances. Board member Susan Whitaker spoke first. "A misunderstanding?" she asked. "The recording appears quite clear." Victoria forced a smile. "I was uncomfortable during the flight and expressed myself poorly. I regret that." Susan looked unconvinced. "You specifically requested that another passenger be moved before speaking to him for more than a few seconds." Victoria hesitated. "As I said, I handled the situation poorly." Another board member, James Holloway, leaned forward. "The issue extends beyond poor judgment. Since this morning, 3 institutional investors have contacted us expressing concern about company leadership." He slid several printed emails across the table. "One investor is considering suspending negotiations entirely." Victoria's confidence began to fade. "Surely we are not making corporate decisions based on social media outrage." Marcus remained silent. Harold looked directly at Victoria. "We are making decisions based on public trust. Sinclair Urban Development builds communities. Reputation matters." James nodded. "Our company depends on partnerships with cities, nonprofit organizations, healthcare systems, and educational institutions. Many of those partners have already called." Susan added quietly, "Employees have also raised concerns. Human Resources received dozens of messages within the last 2 hours." Victoria looked genuinely shocked. "From employees?" "Yes," Susan replied. Many are questioning whether our corporate values reflect our leadership. Victoria turned toward Marcus for the first time since entering the room. Dr. Reed, I want you to know that I never intended to offend you personally. Marcus regarded her calmly. I appreciate the statement, Miss Sinclair. Victoria immediately continued. I hope this incident does not affect the partnership. Thousands of jobs depend on this investment. Marcus folded his hands. Hope Forward Capital does not base decisions on personal grievances. Relief briefly crossed Victoria's face. Then Marcus continued. However, we do evaluate whether organizational leaders embody the principles they publicly promote. The relief disappeared instantly. Marcus spoke without anger. Your company's mission statement emphasizes inclusion, respect, and community partnership. Investors must determine whether those values exist only on paper or in practice. No one in the room argued. The truth was impossible to ignore. The video had exposed more than a single unpleasant interaction. It had raised serious questions about leadership itself. Harold finally cleared his throat. Given the circumstances, the board will enter executive session this afternoon to review leadership matters. Victoria stared at him. Leadership matters? Harold nodded solemnly. Yes, Victoria. Effective immediately. The board must consider what is best for the long-term future of this company. For the first time in her career, Victoria realized that her position was no longer secure. The executive session lasted nearly 3 hours. During that time, Victoria remained alone in her office overlooking Manhattan, watching the city move beneath her, while her own world seemed to stand still. She had called attorneys, public relations consultants, and longtime business allies. Some promised support. Others never returned her calls. By early afternoon, the reality had become impossible to ignore. The video had surpassed 10 million views. Major news networks were covering the story. Industry publications were questioning whether Sinclair Urban Development's leadership reflected the values required to develop housing projects in diverse communities across America. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Rachel knocked softly on Victoria's office door. The board is ready for you, she said quietly. Victoria entered the boardroom to find expressions she had never seen before. There was no anger, no outrage, only disappointment. Chairman Harold Bennett spoke first. Victoria, this has been an extraordinarily difficult discussion. He paused. The board has unanimously concluded that new leadership is necessary. Victoria felt the words like a physical weight. You are removing me? Harold nodded slowly. Effective immediately, you are being placed on administrative leave pending your formal resignation. Victoria looked around the room, searching for support. She found none. Susan Whitaker spoke gently. This decision was not based solely on one incident. The events of this morning forced us to examine broader concerns regarding leadership culture within the organization. James Holloway added, several senior employees have already expressed concerns they previously felt uncomfortable raising. Victoria sank into her chair. For years, she had believed that success insulated people from consequences. Now, within less than 24 hours, that illusion had disappeared. Harold continued, there is additional news. Hope Forward Capital has agreed to proceed with the investment. Victoria looked up immediately. Her eyes moved toward Marcus. You are still investing? Marcus nodded. Yes, thousands of employees, contractors, and families should not suffer because of one individual's actions. The board members visibly relaxed. The company had been saved. Yet Victoria understood the deeper truth. The company would survive. Her career might not. Marcus stood and gathered his papers. Before leaving, he looked toward Victoria. Ms. Sinclair, I sincerely hope this experience becomes an opportunity rather than simply a punishment. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. After everything that happened, you are still willing to help this company? Marcus offered a small smile. Communities need housing. Employees need jobs. My responsibility is larger than personal feelings. With that, he quietly left the room. By 5 o'clock that evening, Sinclair Urban Development publicly announced a leadership transition. Victoria's resignation became national news within minutes. Corporate boards on which she served requested her departure. Speaking engagements were cancelled. Professional organizations suspended her memberships pending review. Less than 24 hours after boarding a plane in Atlanta, Victoria Sinclair had lost the position, influence, and reputation she had spent decades building, and none of it had been taken from her by Marcus Reed. It had been lost through the consequences of her own choices. 3 months later, a cool autumn breeze moved through Central Park as Victoria Sinclair sat alone on a bench, watching families pass by. Life looked very different now. The luxury office was gone. The constant phone calls had stopped. Invitations that once filled her calendar had disappeared almost overnight. For the first few weeks after her resignation, Victoria had been consumed by anger. She blamed the passengers on the plane, the person who recorded the video, the media, the board, and even Marcus Reed. But as the weeks passed and the noise faded, something unexpected happened. For the first time in decades, she was forced to sit quietly with herself. She began meeting with a leadership coach. She volunteered at a local community organization as part of a restorative program suggested by one of her former colleagues. At first, she attended reluctantly. Then, gradually, she started listening to people whose experiences were very different from her own. She heard stories about prejudice, assumptions, and opportunities lost because of snap judgments. Some stories made her uncomfortable. Others left her deeply ashamed. One afternoon, while volunteering at a scholarship fundraiser in Brooklyn, Victoria noticed a familiar figure across the room. Marcus Reed was speaking with several students. He looked exactly as he had on the plane. Calm, approachable, and completely uninterested in attention. Victoria hesitated for several minutes before finally walking toward him. Marcus noticed her immediately and offered the same polite smile he had shown on the flight months earlier. "Ms. Sinclair," he said warmly, "it is good to see you." Victoria lowered her eyes. "Dr. Reed, I did not expect you to remember me." Marcus smiled gently. "I remember everyone I meet." Victoria took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. A real one this time. What I said and how I treated you were wrong. There is no excuse for it." Marcus listened quietly. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. Victoria shook her head. "I spent years believing that status, appearance, and success told me everything I needed to know about people. I was wrong." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Many people make judgments. The important question is whether they are willing to learn from them." Victoria looked at him. "After everything that happened, why did you still save the company?" Marcus glanced toward the students laughing nearby. "Because leadership is not about punishing people when they fail. It is about protecting those who depend on us." He paused before adding, "Character is revealed when we believe no one important is watching. But character is also revealed by what we choose to do after we realize we were wrong." Victoria stood silently for several seconds. Then she extended her hand. Marcus shook it warmly. As they parted, Victoria realized that losing everything had forced her to discover something she had never truly possessed before: humility. And sometimes, the most important journeys do not begin when life is going exactly as planned. They begin when we are finally willing to see people for who they are, rather than who we assume them to be.